Welcome to Hard Script.
Don't interrupt me, my wife said. She said it calmly, the way someone does when they expect obedience, not resistance. The room laughed like it was a joke that landed perfectly. Glasses clinked. Someone near the windows nodded as if this was all part of the program. I stood where I had been standing all evening, a half step behind her shoulder, holding a drink I hadn't touched. This was supposed to be a surprise gathering. That was the word she used when she told me to wear something decent and keep my evening free. She worked in events. Surprises were her currency. I assumed it was for a client or a milestone. Another room full of people who didn't know what I did for a living and didn't need to. The space was loud and polished, rented for effect. Her crowd. People who watched faces before listening to words. She moved easily among them, collecting reactions, directing energy the way I direct traffic plans and load calculations. Different instincts. Different rules. He stood beside her when she said it. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to signal ownership. Confident posture. Familiar ease. The kind of man who doesn't wait to be introduced because he assumes the room already knows who he is. I had seen him once before in passing, attached to one of her clients, shaking hands like he was sealing something bigger than a deal. She kept talking after that line, telling a story that put her in the center of the room. I didn't hear all of it. I noticed the way she didn't look at me. Not once. I noticed how the people nearest us glanced between her and him, then back at their drinks, as if confirming something they already suspected. Someone brushed past me and said my name with surprise, like they'd forgotten I was part of the picture. I nodded. Polite. Present. Exactly what she expected. The night kept moving. Laughter rose and fell on cue. Music shifted. I stayed. I didn't step away. I didn't pull her aside. I didn't give her the scene she'd planned for, the one she could manage and narrate later. When she finished, she reached for her glass and leaned slightly toward him. Not touching. Not yet. Enough to make the point without words. I smiled at the right moments. I thanked the host. I shook hands. I stood there until the room decided I was no longer interesting. She thought this was the moment, the beginning of something new. I realized, standing there, that it was the end of something old. The first sign didn't come from her. It came from someone who had no reason to protect the story she was trying to stage. A man from the venue staff stopped me near the bar while she was across the room, surrounded. He recognized my name from the reservation sheet and thanked me for approving the layout change earlier in the week. His tone was casual, professional, the way people speak when they assume everyone involved is already informed. He mentioned that the other gentleman had been very specific about sightlines and seating, that he'd visited the space twice before the event to make sure everything worked for the announcement. The word landed without emphasis. Not dramatic, just factual. I nodded like it made sense, like I had been part of that conversation. The man moved on, already focused on his next task, leaving me standing with information that didn't belong to me but fit too neatly to ignore. I scanned the room again. The confident man stayed close to her, not guarding, not hovering. He didn't need to. People deferred to him naturally. When he spoke, others leaned in. When she laughed, she checked his reaction first. Small things. Things you don't notice unless you're trained to watch systems instead of surfaces. Another guest I barely knew clapped me on the shoulder and said she was brave for doing it this way. That transparency was rare and impressive. He assumed I was aligned with the plan, that I was standing there by choice. I stayed polite. That was becoming a pattern. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look for confirmation. I didn't confront anyone. I watched. Engineers learn early that systems reveal themselves if you don't interfere too soon. Stress points appear. Redundancies fail. You don't need emotion to see it happen. Across the room, she raised her glass again. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. The people who mattered were already looking at him. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake or a moment that got out of hand. This had structure, rehearsal, intent. She hadn't invited me to be surprised. She'd invited me to witness. The room felt smaller after that. Not claustrophobic. Focused. Like a tunnel narrowing toward a single outcome. I stayed until the energy began to thin and people started planning their exits. I shook more hands. I thanked more people. I made myself forgettable. She caught my eye once, briefly, as if checking whether I was still where she left me. I was. What she didn't notice was that I had stopped reacting. Not because I was numb, but because something had shifted inward, quiet and precise. The evening wasn't over yet, but the direction was already set. I didn't go home with her that night. Not because I stormed out or made a statement. There was no argument to exit, no door to slam. I stayed until the room thinned, until the staff began clearing glasses and the conversation softened into logistics. She was busy saying goodbyes, collecting compliments, leaning into the momentum she'd created. I told her I would follow later, and she nodded without looking up, already turned toward him. I drove instead. No destination in mind. Just movement. Roads make sense to me. They follow rules. They respond to pressure exactly the way they're designed to. The confirmations came quietly after that. Not in a dramatic cascade, not all at once. They surfaced the way infrastructure failures do, when you finally know where to look. A notification from a shared account flagged an unfamiliar charge tied to a hotel brand I didn't recognize. Not close. Not far. Intentional. Another alert followed, then another, all clustered around days she'd said were booked with clients. I didn't react. I adjusted settings and watched the pattern complete itself. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter the next morning, face down but unlocked, lighting up with a message preview she'd forgotten to silence. A name I'd seen on guest lists more than once. Casual language. Familiar rhythm. Nothing explicit. Nothing that needed to be. I left it where it was. I didn't scroll. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't need souvenirs. Later, while she was busy and distracted, I opened the calendar she synced across devices. Events layered over each other too neatly. Site visits that didn't require her presence. Planning sessions scheduled in cities with no contracts attached. Empty spaces that matched the charges almost perfectly. She moved through the apartment that day like everything was normal. Efficient. Light. She talked about follow-ups, about how well the gathering had gone, about opportunities that were opening up. She never mentioned him by name. She didn't need to. The absence of explanation was its own confirmation. I listened. I responded where appropriate. I didn't ask a single question. That was when the real shift happened. Not anger. Not grief. Alignment. I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like someone responsible for dismantling a shared system without triggering alarms. There were leases, accounts, documents, professional overlaps. Long-term structures built for stability, not sudden exits. She believed the difficult part was over. The reveal. The room. The laughter. What she didn't see was that I had begun separating variables. By the time she left for her next meeting, already late and unapologetic, I had made the first call. Not to her. Not to him. To someone who didn't need context, only instructions. The surprise, I realized, hadn't been the gathering. It was how quietly everything else could be undone. The disappearance didn't happen all at once. It unfolded the way controlled shutdowns do, in stages that look harmless until the system no longer responds. I stopped being available. Not in a dramatic way. I answered messages later than usual, then not at all. I stayed out when she expected me home. When she asked if something was wrong, I said I was busy. That word had always worked for her. She respected busy. She built her life around it. I packed quietly. Only what belonged to me. Clothes she never noticed. Tools she never touched. Documents she assumed lived in folders she'd never opened. I left the shared things exactly where they were, intact, as if I planned to return. The apartment didn't look abandoned when I walked out. It looked paused. She was away that day, posting updates from meetings, tagging people who mattered. I watched without interacting, seeing how quickly the room shifted around her when I wasn't there to anchor the edges. She didn't realize yet that I was gone. She thought I was off-grid, temporarily inconvenient. By the next morning, my phone was quiet. I had rerouted calls, changed access, closed loops she didn't know existed. Our shared accounts no longer recognized her credentials the way they used to. Not frozen, just separated, cleanly. I signed papers in an office that smelled like toner and old coffee. The clerk didn't ask why. She only asked if the information was correct. It was. Precision matters in moments like that. When she finally noticed, it wasn't emotional. It was logistical. A message asking where I was. Another asking if I'd moved something important. A third that tried for humor and missed. I didn't respond. That afternoon, Someone from her circle reached out, casual at first, then confused. They assumed there had been a misunderstanding, that I'd taken the reveal badly and needed space. They spoke like intermediaries, not friends. I stayed silent. By evening, the tone changed. Concern crept in, then irritation, then something sharper, masked as curiosity. She hadn't lost me in a fight. She had lost access. I was already somewhere else, sitting in a temporary place with no personal history, watching the city move without me. I felt steady, not relieved, not vindicated, just aligned. The system we'd built together had been designed for permanence. That was its flaw. Permanence assumes consent never changes. She had made her announcement in a room full of witnesses. She had expected a reaction that would confirm her control of the narrative. What she hadn't planned for was absence. No confrontation, no explanation, no visible damage. Just silence where a presence used to be. And silence, I knew, would force her to speak for both of us. The pressure shifted away from me and landed exactly where it should have. He began to feel it first. Not publicly, not in a way that could be traced back to me. The kind of pressure that shows up in delays, questions, and sudden hesitations from people who used to say yes without thinking. I hadn't gone after him. I hadn't needed to. I had simply stopped insulating the space he was moving into. When you work long cycles, you learn where the weight is carried, which partnerships are real and which survive only because no one has tested them. His position in her world depended on momentum and perception. Mine had depended on reliability and quiet fixes. When I stepped out, gaps appeared. A contractor I'd recommended months earlier declined to continue under revised terms. A planning approval slowed without explanation. A call he expected to be returned stayed unanswered. Small things, enough to make him notice without knowing why. She tried to compensate. That was her instinct. More meetings, more visibility, more reassurance offered to people who hadn't asked for it. She spoke louder online. She curated confidence. The problem with that approach is that it draws attention to what's missing. My name began to surface in conversations I wasn't part of. Not as an accusation, as a question. Someone asked if I was consulting independently now. Someone else wondered why a process had changed without my involvement. They weren't looking for drama. They were looking for stability. She reached out again. This time with urgency, she tried to disguise as irritation. She framed it as a practical issue. Things that only I handled. Things she had never needed to learn because I was always there. I didn't respond. He showed up more often after that. Standing closer. Talking longer. Trying to project certainty. The room watched him differently now. Not as a prize. As a variable. I stayed out of sight. I let time do what it does best when no one interferes. Patterns became visible. Confidence thinned. The ease he'd carried into that gathering began to look rehearsed. I hadn't touched him directly. I hadn't said a word. All I had done was remove myself from a structure that relied on me without acknowledging it. The effect was cumulative. She could feel it slipping, but she couldn't name what was wrong. There was no villain to point to, no message to forward, no outburst to justify. Only the slow realization that the man she'd replaced me with was standing on ground I'd reinforced. And I was no longer holding it together. The shift became visible to others before it became undeniable to her. She hosted another gathering not long after, smaller this time, framed as a working dinner. Same crowd, fewer smiles. I wasn't invited, but my absence was discussed in corners I could picture clearly. People asked where I was with a careful tone, as if the question itself might offend someone important. She answered lightly. She always did. She said I was busy, tied up in projects, taking space. The explanations were smooth but inconsistent. In rooms like that, inconsistency is louder than confession. Someone close to her circle mentioned that I had been seen meeting independently, that my name had come up in a conversation that didn't include her. It wasn't framed as gossip. It was framed as surprise. The kind that forces everyone to recalculate. He was there again, trying to hold his position. He laughed at the right moments. He filled pauses with stories that emphasized his reach and influence. The problem was that the room no longer leaned toward him the way it had before. People listened without committing. They watched her reactions instead of his. At one point, someone asked her, gently, whether this was all moving too fast, whether she was sure the timing was right. The question wasn't about him. It was about the gap I'd left. She stiffened. Not visibly, but enough. She answered with confidence that sounded practiced, not grounded. She spoke about alignment and growth in new phases. Words that usually work when no one challenges them. No one did. They didn't need to. The distance formed organically. Invitations slowed. Replies took longer. The energy she relied on began to thin, not because anyone disapproved, but because uncertainty makes people cautious. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of an unfinished story. She noticed it that evening. I knew she did because she reached out afterward, not to me directly, but through someone else. A neutral party. A message framed as concern, then as confusion, then as frustration. They asked if I was planning to resurface, if there was something unresolved. I stayed silent. That silence did more than any statement could have. It forced the room to decide what it believed without my input. By the time the gathering ended, she was no longer at the center. She was managing the edges, answering questions she couldn't close. He stayed close, but now it looked like support, not dominance. And support, I knew, is never what she had wanted on display. Isolation doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in through missed calls and rooms that no longer open the way they used to. She felt it when she stopped knowing who to text first. The people she used to lean on had become careful. Not distant, just non-committal. They listened without offering solutions. They responded without warmth. Support requires clarity, and her story no longer had it. He remained. That was expected. He filled space when space became uncomfortable. But there is a difference between presence and gravity. He could stand beside her, but he couldn't stabilize the ground beneath her feet. I watched from a distance that felt deliberate rather than defensive. Not surveillance. Awareness. I heard things indirectly. The way news travels when no one realizes you're no longer part of the loop. She had been asking about me. Quietly at first. Then, with less restraint. She reached out again, directly this time. The message was longer than the others, shaped to sound reasonable. She referenced logistics. Things that still connected us on paper. She avoided emotion, as if acknowledging it might invite resistance. She framed the separation as temporary, unspoken, unfinished. I didn't respond. The quiet around her thickened after that. She showed up to places she used to avoid, hoping to regain footing. Familiar rooms. Familiar faces. The reactions were polite but restrained. People don't choose sides when there's nothing to gain from choosing. Her confidence began to fracture in small, visible ways. She overexplained. She filled pauses too quickly. She laughed a beat too late. None of it dramatic. All of it noticeable to the kind of people she built her world around. I crossed paths with her once in public. No confrontation. No scene. I was already seated when she arrived, already engaged in conversation that didn't include her. She noticed me late. I felt it without turning. She paused, hesitated, considered crossing the room. She didn't. That was the moment she understood something fundamental had changed. I wasn't avoiding her. I wasn't hiding. I simply wasn't available. Later, I learned she had asked someone close to her whether I was angry. The answer she received was that I didn't seem to be anything. That unsettled her more than anger ever could have. Because anger keeps you connected. Detachment removes the frame entirely. By then, she was standing alone in rooms she once commanded, supported by someone who couldn't give her back what she'd lost. And I had become a presence defined not by absence, but by refusal to re-enter a story that no longer needed me. The confrontation happened without an invitation. She found me where I had begun to exist again, not hidden, just unannounced. A public place neutral enough that neither of us could control it. I noticed her reflection before I saw her directly, the hesitation in her step giving her away. She waited until the conversation I was in ended, until there was no audience to manage, only proximity. She said my name carefully, as if volume alone might decide the outcome. I turned. No surprise. No tension in my posture. Just acknowledgement. She stood too close at first, then corrected herself. That detail mattered. It told me she had rehearsed this moment and still misjudged the distance. She asked where I had gone. Not geographically. Conceptually. Her tone was restrained, almost professional, like she was trying to recover something misfiled rather than lost. She referenced the gathering without naming it. She mentioned confusion, miscommunication, timing. She avoided responsibility without denying it outright. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her version. Silence does most of the work when you let it. She shifted tactics. Asked whether I was seeing someone. Whether this was about pride. Whether I planned to return and discuss things like adults. Each question assumed a role I no longer occupied. I answered once. Briefly. Without explanation. Enough to establish boundaries, not reopen dialogue. That was when her composure cracked. Not dramatically. Just enough for the mask to slip. She told me I had humiliated her by disappearing. That people were asking questions she couldn't answer. That she had expected anger, or negotiation, or at least resistance. Expectation. That word hovered between us. She looked at me like I was withholding something she was owed. Closure. Validation. Reaction. I gave her none. The silence stretched. In that space, she saw what the room had already begun to see. I wasn't frozen. I wasn't waiting. I had moved on structurally, not emotionally. She tried once more, softer this time. A reminder of shared history, of effort, of what we had built. She framed it as loss, but what she was really asking for was reinstatement. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list reasons. I simply didn't step back into the role she was offering. When she realized that, truly realized it, her expression changed. Control drained from it. Not replaced by panic, but by something quieter and harder to manage. Understanding. I nodded once. The way you do when a meeting has reached its end, and returned to my place without looking back. She stayed where she was, holding a conversation that no longer included me. And that was the only confrontation she would get. The collapse didn't announce itself. It unfolded in fragments that no one rushed to collect for her. It started with cancellations framed as scheduling conflicts, then delayed responses that turned into silence. Projects she had counted on stalled without explanation, not because anyone blamed her, but because momentum had moved elsewhere. In her world, movement was everything. Standing still looked like failure. He couldn't stop it. He tried, but his influence had limits. He could offer presence, reassurance, even resources, but he couldn't restore what had been quietly withdrawn. The rooms she used to command no longer rearranged themselves around her arrival. People were polite, attentive even, but distant. They watched her the way you watch someone whose footing you're no longer sure about. She reached out to family, then pulled back when their concern felt too close to judgment. She reached out to friends, then grew frustrated when they asked questions she couldn't answer cleanly. Everyone wanted clarity. She had none to give. My absence had become the center of the story without my participation. People didn't know what had happened, but they knew something had shifted. They sensed a fault line and adjusted their steps accordingly. I heard about her indirectly. Not gossip. Updates. She was tired. She was stretched thin. She was trying to hold everything together while pretending nothing had changed. The effort showed. It always does. She ran into problems she used to hand off without thinking. Contracts she didn't fully understand. Processes she'd never needed to manage. She discovered how much of her stability had depended on systems she hadn't built and no longer had access to. There was no one moment when it all fell apart. No single loss dramatic enough to explain the rest. That was the hardest part for her. There was nothing to fight, nothing to blame, just the steady erosion of certainty. She looked for me once more, through a channel she hadn't tried before. The message was short, direct, not defensive. She didn't ask for reconciliation. She asked for understanding. I didn't respond. By then, she was standing in the aftermath of her own decision, surrounded by reminders she couldn't edit or reframe. The gathering that had been meant as a declaration had become a reference point people mentioned carefully, as if it marked the beginning of something they didn't want to repeat. She had wanted visibility, control, a clean transition. What she got instead was distance, uncertainty, and the slow realization that the one person who had anchored her world had stepped away without leaving a mark she could follow. And there was nothing left for her to do but stand there and feel it. The last moment didn't look like an ending. There was no dramatic exchange to signal it, no raised voices or final accusations. It arrived quietly, the way conclusions usually do when all the noise has already burned itself out. The documents were finalized without conflict. Signatures placed where they needed to be. Processes completed the way processes always are when neither side is trying to win, only to finish. She didn't contest anything. I didn't offer concessions. What we had shared was dismantled carefully, without urgency, without commentary. We crossed paths once more after that. Not planned, not avoided. A familiar environment that no longer belonged to either of us. She looked different. Not broken, not fragile. Just stripped of the certainty she used to carry like armor. The confidence that once filled rooms had condensed into something smaller, more cautious. She acknowledged me first this time. A nod. Controlled. Measured. She didn't step closer. She didn't speak. She waited. I returned the nod. Nothing more. She seemed to expect a pause, a softening, some signal that the distance could still be negotiated. When it didn't come, she inhaled as if preparing to say something important, then stopped herself. That restraint told me everything I needed to know. She had finally understood the rules had changed. I didn't stay long. I never do now. I've learned to leave places before they start asking things of me. Later, someone told me she had spoken about that gathering differently. Not with pride. Not with regret she could perform. With a kind of neutrality that suggested the story no longer gave her leverage. It had become something she survived, not something she owned. As for me, I didn't disappear. I stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. The difference mattered more than anyone realized at the time. I returned to work that demanded patience instead of applause. To relationships that didn't require performance. To rooms where silence wasn't a threat, but a sign of trust. She had wanted a moment that would define her next chapter. She got it. So did I. The only difference was that I didn't need witnesses to make it real. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.